Nirant Kasliwal works at Sundial. He has been one of the youngest guests on CTQ Smartcast. That itself should be reason enough for you to find out what we spoke to him about. Soul_Kadi on Twitter recommended Nirant to us and wanted to know how he taught himself natural language processing and went on to write a book on it. We decided to go beyond this to understand his take on why he wrote the book, what prep went to it, and how his world changed after writing. Mind you, he published this book just 2 or 3 years after graduating from BITS Pilani. Nirant shared his views on a bunch of things, including work culture at Indian and non Indian startups, and tips on how to find out the hidden truths about the company you are interviewing with. Our conversation covered a lot of areas from books to hobbies, writers to democracy. So, if you are interested in the world of tech startups, there are valuable lessons to pick here, both for the entrepreneur as well as someone looking to work for one. Welcome, Nirant. Welcome to the CTQ Smartcast.
Thank you, Harish. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so let's get started with the idea or with the question that brought us together on Twitter. Somebody connected us. So you wrote the book Natural Language Processing with Python, a quick starter guide. So tell us about this book writing journey. What was the whole writing process like, and what did you to make the book? I don't know, so successful that Dr. Andrew Nog actually recommends it. So talk us through the whole process.
Yeah, so actually, Dr. Andrew Ng doesn't recommend the book directly, he recommends a different work. But coming back to the book itself, so I was going to do the work which eventually got converted into the book anyway. So I'd written down an outline and published it on GitHub as a README and set up a repo and everything. And written arguably what was the first chapter. So I was already organizing it as chapters because there was sequencing to it. And unlike traditional machine, like in machine learning, we think about pipelines, so it was organized as a pipeline, which I just collapsed and made it a chapter flow. The publisher reached out based on that okay, this outline looks good to us, would you want to do this? We already have a series on the very similar themes. So yeah, that got flipped into the book on the condition that my code still continues to be open source. So that was the agreement. So yeah, that was it. That was quite a few years ago, but yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, so when was this, Nirant? Which year was this? When did this whole thing start for you?
I think it was 2018. I should look it up. So I remember I started writing the book in February, March, and it came out just before Diwali of that year. Yeah, this was in 2018. The book published in 2018. Yeah.
Okay, and this was how many years after you graduated from engineering college?
So I graduated in 2016 from Pilani. So for context, this is 2 years out of college.
Right. So this is, not very common, right? People who have just started working or who just graduated 2 years earlier writing a book like this. So what did you do different? What was special about the whole process? Was there something did you set this goal very early in your life that, yeah, I want to get better at this, I'm going to do deep research, I'm going to actually articulate this, and the book is just a manifestation? How did the whole thing come about? Tell us more about that.
So very honestly, that there was no explicit checkpoint saying that, okay, I should write a book. That was something which happened accidentally as a part of the process, as you mentioned. My inherent goal was that I need to do something which is like a demonstrable proof of work, in that sense that like the book basically acts like, okay, I know this. If I've written the book, I probably know bulk of what is in the book, right? Obviously I've forgotten most of it and the book is probably outdated. But it also signals sincerity, right? Which is in at least the kind of tail end work which I do, which is toward applied research, signaling sincerity is also equally important. I can sit down in front of a desk for long hours. That is exactly what a book does. My personal selfish interest was that as part of writing the book and getting it reviewed, edited, everything, for instance, the book has like some 8 or 10 chapters. I must have thrown out 2 chapters and written them from scratch. 2 or 3 had partial rewrites. So during these multiple iterations, I got to learn a lot about how to structure and communicate to developers, as well as my muscle memory for doing the kind of NLP tasks which are in the book is exceptionally high even today. Because if you spend like 50-100 hours just obsessing about how to do this like one small piece, then you will really get good at it. It's the same thing as cycling, that if you keep cycling for 100 hours, cycling will come naturally to you. So, yeah.
And when you say you wanted to have a demonstrable piece of work, When did this interest in natural language processing, how did this start for you? Was this something that started during engineering, before engineering? Because having published a book means there has been years of work that has gone into it. So it can't be something which has been done in 2 years. That would, result in a very shallow level of expertise there, which is not the case. So how did this whole thing start?
So the honest answer to that is that it is probably I've discovered a lot. I've traveled to multiple worlds within machine learning before the book and after the book both. So focusing on before the book, I did a lot of the dashboarding analytics work for a Delhi-based startup which was in hospitality. And one of the things which they used to obsess about is forecasting which hotels will have high occupancy, which is basically saying that my room shouldn't go empty. Even if I have to discount it, it's better to not go empty because like empty is just much worse than discounting. So that was the very early start. But which was more focused on things like predictive analytics. I did a bunch of that with text-based processing at another startup called belong.co, which is where I first got a flavor of how text is supposed to be handled, because string handling for machine learning is very different from numerical handling. That is probably not true anymore in 2021, but at that time it was very different. 2015, 16 is what we're talking about. From that point, after that, I spent a year doing embedded systems, machine learning on embedded systems, like around sensor fusion problems and things like that at Samsung Research. And then is when I did computer vision. And during computer vision, I realized that there is a deep learning. Deep learning is basically like a horizontal layer, which is going to then consume tasks because of how data efficient it is, or how it allows people to just throw compute and learn from it. And based on what we had seen on predictive analytics and other previous attempts at scaling search and similar things, I knew that this trend is going to be sticky because people already know how to handle large volumes. Now they just want to of data. They now just want to throw large volumes of compute at data, which is like a very logical step. And that makes sense. Yeah, that was the reason I wanted to do computer vision as well as NLP at that time. And the book in that sense became answer now to your specific thing, that it's less that it's years of work, but when people put in years of work, a lot of it is in short bursts. For me, it is an extremely high intensity period of a year or two, instead of actually a year and a half, instead of like short bursts. So to give you context, I think I used to spend anywhere between 10 to 12 hours a week, which is basically an entire working day, on the book and doing NLP before that. So it's more intense than it's not bursty.
Yeah, and you mentioned the hospitality startup that you were working for and belong. So was this while you were at BITS?
Yeah, that was an undergrad. These are internships.
These were internships. So you
Yeah.
actually took the work that you were doing as part of your internships, worked towards it, expanded it, and now it's much easier to connect the dots looking backwards, is it?
Yeah. So it's unfair to say that it's also a little bit of looking forward.
Yeah.
A lot of these things are actually predictable to people who were doing it at that time, right? So for
Hmm.
instance, to me, the idea that predictive analytics is going to be very important for something which somebody sat down and explained to me over an extremely long meeting. And then I would just look for it's a contradicting evidence that why would this fail.
Hmm.
And there were a lot of cases. In fact, even today there are people who will say machine learning has no value, and then or deep learning has no value. If people understand what machine learning is and deep learning is a subset, they will say, oh, and then they will very interestingly go on and see this on Twitter, which is a feed powered by deep learning, or they will search for things on Google, which today admits that something like 1/3 of their search volume is served by deep learning stacks. So it's extremely hilarious when people say that, oh, machine learning is not used anywhere. Especially, for instance, a lot of the Google search in Hindi is made possible because of deep learning innovations. That is why search in Hindi was so bad before this. So it's extremely hilarious and self-defeating for companies or any team to say that, oh, machine learning is a bad idea in hindsight. But at that time, it was not so obvious because there were a lot of these people and they were extremely loud and they were extremely well respected in the industry, to put it in context. Not just in India, even globally, there were a lot of critiques of machine learning and deep learning both, which were the two bets which I made.
And when you say you made these two bets and this was a result of a long conversation, I also read your blog post about aiming to be like in the top 200, 200 or was it 2000 of
2000 basically, yeah,
2000, right?
1000 to
Yeah.
2000.
Yeah, top 2000 people in that area at your age.
Yeah.
So was that something which you wrote post this journey? Was this like looking back, or was that also something which was brewing in your mind back when you were in college in 2016, 2017?
Yeah, I think a version of this idea existed in my head in college as well, because BITS Pilani by definition is an extremely competitive place, especially for computer science grads or anything adjacent. So I was in information systems. There are 2 or 3 tracks which you pick up in software, right? One is you pick up, you go the research route, which is like you go master's, PhD, and then and you discover your topics of interest through that route. The other is you start with competitive programming, go into systems or backend engineering, and the basic interview process around that is even till this date structured around competitive programming or data structures question. And the third is everything else. Everything else is a very large bucket which nobody knows and keeps changing. It's like a moving goalpost.
Right.
I had to, like any sober, sane person would pick among these first two tracks, right? Unfortunately, my GPA was so bad that I could not qualify for good research places. And by speaking to people, I realized that the gap between, let's say, like the first and the 10th in a research institution is extremely high. The way to, like, most people think that a good is good. Think in terms of grades, right? There is a range. There is no range. I've realized that these are like points on a spectrum, and each point is extremely far from the other. So that way, I realized that research tracks don't make a lot of sense unless I can aim for the best. And similar thing for computer programming, I realized that my peers, by the time I was doing this homework in third year of my college, most of my peers had been doing computer programming for 2-3 years. So they were exceptionally good at it. So for a question which even did not make sense to me, they would be able to solve in 25-35 minutes. And this was exceptionally humiliating and, among other things, humbling. In that time, humiliating, and hindsight, humbling. So I realized that I needed to differentiate myself. And it's okay if I'm in a very small space, as long as the space keeps growing at a certain predictable rate. And that is the theme which occurred. And that is the theme which I learned by, again, speaking to people. And one of the things which I read around that time was an essay which argued that, which had a comparison between film stars and physicists. That a lot of people argue that movie industry is a bad place to make a career because only, let's say, like the top 100 or 200 get good jobs. Physics is worse because only the top 10 get good jobs. So the only rational reason to do physics is that you're happy with poverty. And this was written, I think the essay was written by like a Nobel laureate in physics. So it was exceptionally interesting to somebody who has been an academic, right? And winning Nobel in late 20th century in physics is exceptionally hard. Like unlike Niels Bohr, and like the bulk of modern physics is done in that sense. So it was very interesting to see how these people thought about these careers. And that theme of that you need to be in a top certain percentile of any game you play, it's very sticky in my head.
And again, I'm trying to put myself in your shoes in your third year and fourth year of engineering when, like you say, there are these people who are cracking these problems within 25, 35 minutes and just struggling to figure out what the problem is. Like you said, it can be humiliating. And I guess there are two ways after that, right, of how you deal with it. One is you get dejected and, okay, it's self-defeating and I can't go anywhere. The other approach is what you have taken. Probably there is a third approach where you just go with the flow, do what, say, 60-70% of your class is doing and things like that. So at that point, if you can talk me through that point, how did it feel? And were there any points where you started questioning yourself? How did you reach out to these people who actually gave you advice like this? How did you chance upon reading that essay by this physicist? Can you talk me through that?
So I think I'm basically an internet first person, right? So when people say, where do you live? So Derek Sivers has this essay again on less local, where he argues that a lot of people in a certain income group and socioeconomic class, we spend so much of our time online. And within online, I used to read a lot on Quora and used to write also somewhat on Quora. So today Twitter has replaced Quora for me, but I still spend a lot of time there. So that is how I stumbled into that physicist essay and then multiple topics in the same theme. And so that is on that. On the process of the emotional journey, which you mentioned earlier, that is exactly how it looks, except for the fact that the option there you are doing 60th percentile of what your peers are doing, or whatever, at least peers in the immediate sense, right? Because arguably people at BITS Pilani are not the best, because it was very obvious, because they would do probably something like a 3000 in a global competition, right? So that means that there are 3000 people which are obviously better in the same age group, because these are like college focused competitions and things like that. I'm like, okay, 3000 people in just who are already better than these people, and these people are already, let's say, on some arbitrary scale, 2 years, 3 years ahead of me, assuming we have the same intelligence, which is probably not true, by the way. Okay, they're way smarter than me. So I was like, why would I want to pick a fight? And then the other thing is you lock into yourself in that game, because once you're on the treadmill that I have to get better at competitive programming, you can't hop off because there is no differentiation. Your entire differentiation is that I'm good at clearing interviews. And then to build differentiation will take 5-10 years of your career. So you're locked into that game for 5-10 years. I do not want to lock myself into that game. I've probably gotten better at competitive programming also since graduating. But at that time, I realized I only have a year and not even like an entirety of a year, because I have an internship coming and I have all of these exams and whatnot and that the entire academic workload. So I chose to differentiate. But I also spent extremely long days, locked myself in the room, not going for any classes, not doing absolutely anything, being completely immobilized, because the feeling of rejection is extremely real, physical, and visceral, at least for me. I've come to learn that it's not for a lot of people. But for me, it was extremely visceral. It's just that I was very lucky and extremely blessed that I had friends who were like, would always keep pushing my frame of mind to not what is or what has happened, but what I want to do next. And I'm extremely grateful to them even today.
I think that's a great thing to have, having that support system, which you have so well identified and acknowledged here. Just to give some context for our listeners, people like you who were in your situations, what were the other paths they ended up taking over the last 6-7 years?
A lot of people went to B school. They dropped out of the doing things with their own hands track itself, because they realize that it's very competitive. And in hindsight, probably not a good decision, because it's too soon to say, because a B school is like a 10-15 year bet and we are on year 5 of our careers. A lot of people went to B school. A lot of people spent a year or two working in industry and then went for masters in research. Basically, they changed the game. But it's a soft reset, because mentally they're still participating in the programming game, because the interviews there are also DSA focused. It's just they're less competitive than India. So they've changed the terrain, which is also like equally advantageous, is how I see it. Because for the amount of, I would argue that an average fresher American interview is probably 1/3 in how hard it is, maybe less than what is the equivalent in India. Indian interviews tend to be more competitive, harder, and take longer prep time, and rely a lot more on you being calm and cool in the interview itself. Like, so there's like a mental game to it, that can you solve the question, and then there's an emotional game to it, can you solve it under pressure in that time window. So that is another few track which I've seen is very popular and works out well. What else have people have tried the same track which I have, which is go in startups but differentiate not via, they try to ship a lot more, ship in good places, and pick startups which are already slightly late stage, because a unicorn in 2016 was late stage. For context, today we get unicorns very early, but in 2016 unicorns were still slightly late stage. So people have built careers around that, but that hasn't worked out well for them, or for most people who took the startups, but hasn't worked out well. Yeah.
And for someone who's, say, in third or fourth year today, what would your advice be in terms of how to think about their own niche, and what are the opportunities? What has changed since 2016? What should people look forward to in India?
I think that question has a very interesting, you said, right, in India. I think the one thing which has meaningfully changed is you should basically stop thinking about India, right? Aim to work for either remote US companies or Europe, anywhere on earth except India is what I would encourage. Because I've worked across multiple cultures. I was with Korean counterparts in Samsung, then American counterparts at Soroco, then Indians at Verloop, and then again now Indians who have been in US at Sundial. And then across, obviously, did a little bit of machine learning consulting in between. I can de facto guarantee that from both your learning experience as well as your emotional mental experience, you will learn a lot more by working for teams outside India. That includes, in fact, if I were to rank, it's if you're working with a counterpart in US and you have to stay up overnight because of Pacific or East Coast time, that is probably higher preference than a company which has an Indian office. So for instance, among very good teams which have set up Indian offices, there are Coinbase, Rippling. I think Gusto is going to set up in India. So that is a really good team. Stripe has a remote India job office. Stripe will probably take preference over Coinbase, and for these softer reasons, that you will work with your American peers and your counterparts directly, who already have good best practices figured out, who have done 2 or 3 trials of what doesn't work. So they can just skip you all that pain of what doesn't work and tell you this works. So you don't have to unlearn things. For me, a lot of these 5 years has been and it's going to be for the next 5 years, by the way, because I've incurred debts. Now I'll have to pay off this debt. I'll have to unlearn a lot of things which don't work, but they are habits for me, which are bad habits, right? It's like it's easier to never smoke than to give up smoking while a trade-off. So now that I've done the equivalent of smoking for work, now it's harder to give up smoking.
Can you give me some examples of what these bad habits are?
I'll give you a very small but representative example of in India, the default way we think about anybody reporting to us in a functional hierarchy is that the person is going to move the calendar around when I'm available, right? That is not the norm, and where talent is rarer. That includes for by extension Europe, Australia, US, Canada, everything. You say, sir, I have 3 hours of window available. Tell me when you want to. So, like the manager will work around you because your time when you can write code is sacred, while manager does not have a sacred time zone. This spills over into everything else. If you ask for, oh, I want the PyCharm paid edition, the manager is not going to dispute it. Like they will not even think about disputing. It's like, why would I ever do that? That will be like, that is exactly the conversation I've had with people. Why would I prevent you from buying something which costs $300 a year? But that makes zero sense. While in Indian companies, there will be so much process around it. There's teams, especially in startups, where there's so much process around it that you will just give up, even if you get an eventual budget approval. There are all this respect for talent and how they transfer knowledge as well is exceptionally high. I think this is like a part of the maturity curve, right? Those teams have been through these cycles 2 or 3 times. A bulk of early teams in India, I'm not saying, let's say, Unicorn or beyond, but early teams in India do a lot of trial and error, which there is no requirement for trial and error. These things have been done 25 times over in the last 25 years. We just don't know who to ask. That's a problem. That's all. Like people are willing to share, but we don't know who to ask and how to ask. Yeah, I don't know if this is a good example or not, but
no, this is actually a fantastic example because we work in the area of helping startups, rather these startups which have done all the hard work of having found the product market fit and all that, now ready to scale, and how to align their strategy and culture, right? And when we say culture, it is the things that you do. It is not what you spend on. It's not the ping pong table. It's not the perks that you give, but actually how these kind of processes are put in place and what you actually do. And this is a great example. Some of the companies that we work with do completely opposite of what you've just mentioned in terms of how bureaucratic the process can be. And that is something which they've taken a very deliberate decision on. This is the kind of culture that we want to build. We want to trust our people. And then obviously it works both ways, right? There are playbooks that are created for these kind of flows or functions or whatever you want to call it, and people are happy to actually do this as well. If you can just talk to me about how things work in, say, the remote setting with non-Indian companies, right? You gave me these examples. Then what are the other challenges that somebody might face in a setting like this, which could be a socio-cultural shock? Because one thing that we always see is, yeah, we want people to take more ownership, but they're still looking for guidance from us, is a thing that we get from sort of founders and senior leaders. Because of the way the Indian education system is there and all of that.
blame to past mistakes.
Correct.
So you can be like, my parents taught me.
Exactly,
Like,
right.
you can
Yeah.
understand.
We've had one case where people have said, I've given whatever $100 for learning, but nobody's actually used it till now. Things like that. So, what are these cultural shocks that people may get when they work with a non-Indian company? And how did you deal with them? What should people watch out for? We've spoken about the nice things, the good things, but what are the other things that can be counterintuitive?
So just to call it out, it has nothing to do whether the team is Indian or not. It's about the ethos.
Correct. Yeah, all the companies that we work with, a lot of them are Indian, but they don't stick to this. So yeah, perfectly get that point.
So what I'm saying is like the Indian traditional ethos
Right.
and norms of working versus a lot of Indian teams also have a lot of Western ethos and cultures because so don't want to like club them together, want to
Correct.
that they're two different.
Yeah.
I think a very good example of this would be that once you pick up something, if you are struggling or if you're not able to make progress, or so when I say struggling in the sense that the complexity is so high that you can't wrap your head around it. The second is it's tedious. You realize that it's going to take me much longer. And then maybe we don't have the time, maybe we have time. Or there is a better solution, right? All three of these are slightly adjacent ways of thinking about something. The default American experience is that you escalate this to your manager or peer, who is the functional expert, whosoever is a functional expert, and you can challenge somebody and say, you know what, your solution is bad, or the way we've structured this problem is bad. This is what I recommend, and if it's wrong, it's fine. So you're both, when you propose an alternative, you're both going to take an ego hit because the original solution was probably wrong, and there is still a chance that what you are proposing is still bad.
Correct.
Right? You're both risking it. You both have skin in the game, just on different points in the timeline, and you're both very happy with it because you know that you both get like the incentive is in solving the problem.
Right.
Right? Like that the incentives are structured and aligned, and that a lot of my first hand and second hand, like first hand experience and second hand, is that people are not that open when they say, oh, I've given ownership, I've given budgets, but then there is nobody leading by example because you've never set that tone. For instance, in India, a lot of teams have unlimited time off, and then you see people coming to office like 2 days after they've recovered from COVID, and like, why are you going to burp? Like, why are you doing this? Makes zero sense. You're like, you're barely walking, you can't even go to the coffee machine yourself. Like, why bother? That cultural norm has to be set by leaders, right? If founders or your immediate reporting manager has not spent its L&D budget and has not advertised, oh, this is what I did, this is how I spent it, you will never. Humans are basically mimicry machines, right? How we should think about this. If they don't, you will not. And founders are, I shouldn't blame founders. Any hierarchy, even skill-based hierarchies, work on mimicry. So there are two types of hierarchy, right? There is the implicit skill-based hierarchy, which somebody is a better engineer than me by default, right? A front-end engineer is going to be very different from me, and I have to go with what he says. If I try to use my head there, I will probably do worse than what that person does. It's obvious. And then there is a hierarchy in terms of what you can think of as like a chain of command structure. Both hierarchies, it's all about example setting. Like, you do, and then you ask people to think about it, they might do it. If you say people do it, they will probably not, because they're like, oh, this is an option which I can choose to exercise, but I don't want to because nobody else has done it, so it's probably a bad thing. They might not put it in this exact phrasing, but that is broadly what the mental model is. That applies to leaves, that applies to L&D budgets, that applies to software budgets, and whatnot.
Yeah. I think actions always speak louder than words, and I think this is where the whole surfacing of these stories of what people are doing is so important, because that is what gives people the confidence that, oh, my peer has done this. It is okay for me to do it.
So I think a lot of teams need to spend a lot more in advertising things, right? So one of the things one of the examples I recent, like not where I work but somewhere else, is that they did a major hiring process change because hiring has gotten much harder for engineering. And the process change was initiated by somebody of SD2 level or something like that, just 3 to 5 years experience, working with recruiters. Engineers typically don't like working with recruiters. So the management basically went out of their way, documented that entire process change, whatever went wrong in that process, how the engineer was eventually penalized because engineer did not write enough code for it. And they basically made a case study of a negative case study indirectly, because now they have documented the fact that if you work with recruitment to improve recruitment, we will penalize you for it. So it was extremely hilarious. So this is their intent was the opposite. Their intent was to advertise that, oh, we have done this amazing process change which has given some amazing results. But when people go, like every engineer then went and said, okay, does this engineer get promoted based on this or rewarded for it in some other way? People were like, no, he got punished for it. So then they're like, oh, this makes zero sense. Why will I do this? So don't do that.
That's an anti-story.
Yeah.
One question that comes to mind when you're talking about this is, like you gave this example where people actually read about what really happened to that engineer. How much of importance do engineers who are joining startups or companies, how much importance do they give to the kind of culture they want to go and be a part of? The example that you gave about how you went to this chai sutta place and got some murky details about the company that you are about to work for. So how much do people actually do this?
I'm inclined to believe that a lot of my immediate peers do this a lot, much more than what people believe. At the same time, I think that there's a segment which doesn't do it at all or doesn't do enough of it. They will talk to the person the founder has introduced to you, maybe once outside the interview process, and they'll be like, okay, this person says the same thing as the founder said, and that's true. What has happened is, because this is a cat and mouse game, now the founder and that engineer has exchanged notes and they've figured out the script. This is what we say, these are the 4 points we'll talk about. and that's why they're in near perfect sync. This is especially true for if you were to talk second time founders or people who are hiring for mid career roles. Because who is going to hire for a mid career role? It's going to be the VP of that function or a
Correct.
CTO equivalent. That guy is obviously a veteran. He's played this game, right? It's stupid to assume that he's not smarter than you. He obviously is smarter than you, right? That's a default assumption to make.
Correct.
So you need to put in more effort than that smart person to play that game well. If that person is going to spend 30 minutes in prepping, you need to spend an hour or two in figuring out questions which they're probably not saying notes on. So my favorite question on that is, how do you ship? How does one code change go into production? If you ask that to a CTO and they cannot answer that, and then sometimes their answer doesn't align with somebody who's way junior, that's like an extremely high signal way of learning that the CTO doesn't know how their team ships. That's like such a big red flag. And you'll be surprised how many CTOs don't.
Okay.
Like the fraction is exceptionally high. They were like, oh, we have set up Jenkins or something like that, and they assume that is it. That takes care of the integration and deployment. That is, they're talking about the tooling.
Right.
The experience of the person who's actually writing that code or doing bug fixing or debugging is very different. They're like, you know what, Jenkins fails my build 5 times in an hour, and every build takes 20 minutes to fail. That means I can only do 5 trials in a day. So I'm just so slow. It doesn't matter whether the point of Jenkins is to speed you up, but if it's so that means you haven't done what is the confusing the process for the goal kind of thing. So that the CTO will tell you in exceptional detail, oh, you know what, we use Jenkins and all of this. And then you ask the junior engineer in the team, they're like, yeah, we use Jenkins, it's so bad. I'm just not trying to haze Jenkins in particular. I'm just giving you an example of that.
Correct.
So to answer your question, I think a lot of people either do bad ref checks in the sense that they're incomplete. They don't talk to people across the hierarchy, or they don't ask questions which are pertinent to them in that setting. But both of these is still better than doing no ref checks. And a lot of people don't. You should do at least 1 or 2 blind ref checks. When I say blind, as in people who are not introduced to you by the founder or somebody in the team. Like you go find somebody on Twitter or LinkedIn and talk to them.
Not a plant, basically.
Yeah. I was trying very hard not to phrase it that way, but that's the idea. So blind ref checks is, to me personally, sacred. I will probably not even interview with a company at this point. If I've spoken to one, I'll not finish an interview with them till I finish 1 or 2 blind ref checks.
Yeah. And when you are comparing 3 or 4 companies, and these days the big refrain is that, oh, everybody is shopping for offers and this and that. So when they do that, when they are looking at 3 or 4 offers, assuming the monetary part is more or less similar, what would you choose as the differentiators, and what do you see more and more people using to compare different offers? Is there a dissonance between what you do and what you see generally people doing? And
so that's a very difficult question to answer for people at large. I'll try to answer it for myself.
Correct. Okay.
So I think as I said, once the cash and ESOP component is in the same comparable range, where comparable range is typically plus minus 10%, I would argue that the person you will reporting to or the founders themselves, their credentials make a huge difference. If I were to give them points on a scale of 100, this will probably be at least 40 to 60% of the differentiation. And that makes a lot of difference. So I've seen first-time founders, even despite being amazing or raising a decent seed or A round, by virtue of the fact that they don't have any credentials within the industry and having not done anything before that and not spent enough effort in employer branding, you just don't want to work with them because you don't know how that person is. You can't trust that. On the other hand, if I know that this person was, let's say, a staff engineer at Google versus, or let's say a principal at Amazon, a director at, let's say, Nutanix or Facebook, I already know that these people have been trained and groomed to manage engineers. They know how they've been coached how to manage, and how I think I can just tell them bluntly and they will get it. Right. I can say, okay, sir, this is how I do my software estimation. They will thank you. Now I understand how to work around you. Right. They just saves so much communication overhead, which is very important and remote. You can compress very high because there is a lot of shared context. And obviously there is a skill check. Like a principal at Amazon is by default better than, let's say, a lot of the CTOs who are just out of college. So that goes a long way, especially for attracting mid to senior people. Because I have been, for instance, if you were to look at my career, I've been doing tech for 4 or 5 years. I already know the bulk of hygiene. right? Whatever is hygiene on how to structure code, I know it.
Correct.
Now I want to learn about things which are probably less obvious, right? Like the next, like if let's say if there is like 100% of this, I know the first 5% really well now, right? Maybe not the best, but enough that I can build on it on myself now. I can start building without you coaching me or prompting me. The next 5 to 10% where I have zero visibility is what I want my manager to step in and give me that context. So yeah, that makes a lot of difference, that your senior leadership is figured out, and they are well respected preferably. In fact, one of the things which I tell at least my friends who are founders is, please hire a VP or equivalent or any functional head basically who can just bring in the 5 people they worked with, barring salaries. Because if their previous team doesn't want to work with them, that means something is already wrong.
Yeah, yeah. And in your experience, now I'm like going to the other side of the fence or table, whatever you want to call it. In your experience, how has the fact that you have a book published changed the flow of conversation between founders and you, between recruiters and you?
I think at least with Indian recruiters, that has not changed a lot. I think in India, there's still a lot of aloo batata mindset is what I call it. An engineer is an engineer. There's very little differentiation for most recruiters. Not saying all, right? There are a lot of recruiters which I am friends with and I respect. For instance, Mahesh at Unacademy is an exceptionally good person. You will want to know him and work with him independent of where he is. For instance, if tomorrow he goes to a different company, I will be like, yeah, great. So then there are people who put zero effort in this and they're very transactional. You don't want to. So I think the book doesn't make a difference at all.
That's
with
interesting.
With
That's...
US and doesn't really make a difference unless they have read the book or looked at my GitHub repo. Because the proof of work is not by the virtue of the fact that I've published it. It's from the fact that I've put in that much effort, as I was saying, it's sincerity.
Correct.
So they will just immediately go to the GitHub. They will just not care whether it's a published book because they understand the effort required is in writing that code and structuring and communicating it, not in typesetting it and publishing it. Right? The typesetting and publishing is not that valuable to them within for whatever they're going to hire me for. Right? So they're very clear understanding about it.
Right.
With consulting, it makes a lot of difference because it's like a straightforward credential. Yes, sir, I know what I'm saying. Please trust me. It makes a lot of difference when I'm doing technical consulting of any sort, especially with Australia kind of market. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it's actually quite interesting. I did not expect that answer with respect to the Indian recruiters. Why would you say that? To me, it looks like a very, very credible way of actually talking about your expertise, right? Like we discussed in the beginning, it's not just the fact that you have a book out, but there is work that has gone into that book, right? And it is a side project. It has taken a lot of years of hard work, and all that is what is being manifested in that book. So that's like a clear 3 pluses in my eyes. So what changes? Is that because others have comparable or better portfolios, or does it really, this kind of expertise is not what they are looking for? What's different?
I think it's basically what has happened is, like, I'm speaking from my personal experience and I don't know if this is true, right?
We're guessing here. That's okay.
Yeah. So my hypothesis is that every recruiter at this point realizes that this is a numbers game, right? It's you can only do top of the funnel. You keep expanding top of the funnel, and conversion is whatever luck plays out. And once you have internalized that mindset, you don't really care who you're reaching out to, right? As long as the person has, you will always by default want to carry reach out to people and talk to people in a way which is very what I call algorithmic way, right? Here, Ocha, has this person worked at one of the 5 companies which we want to hire from? Has this person come from a college which we care about, right? They don't look at incidental credentials like a book, or for instance, I've given talks at Pipe and I have given talks elsewhere as well. But for instance, none of this plays out. They just don't care. So because they don't have the bandwidth to care, right? The founder doesn't care, the recruiter by extension doesn't care.
Right.
It's a very straightforward thing because everybody's internalized the idea that this is a numbers game. So they only focus on top of the funnel and try to convert. That conversion is in God's hand. I can't do anything. That is the mindset people have. I don't know if that is actually true or not. but that is the mindset people have. So it's
Yeah.
completely understandable. I don't think it boils. I don't think I don't know if one of the hypotheses which you shared was that it's not enough differentiation. I think it is, especially given that after the book came out in 2018, I've given a keynote, sorry, not a keynote, talk on a very adjacent topic at PyCon, which was also on NLP. And I think that credential is still fresh. There's like the field is so sensitive that sometimes credentials gets outdated, but that is not true. I've kept it fresh in some way or the other. So I suspect that it is enough differentiation, at least in my understanding. Is just that people don't care. In India, people don't care. In US, makes a difference every once in a while. Yeah, but wahan pe there is a different problem that I get rejected because it's not a generalized machine learning credential. It's a very narrow language processing credential. So yeah, that's a different dynamic altogether.
But then for students and for people who are just getting started on their professional journey, is there any incentive on creating a portfolio of sorts, which is not just their GitHub repository, but all these other things, the
No,
talks and the book?
there is
And
no incentive.
there is no incentive, right? Because
There is no real incentive. Obviously, it looks glamorous from the outside. I assume, but there is no real incentive.
right.
It doesn't help you in any meaningful way.
Hmm.
In the career sense of things, it definitely helps because, for instance, right now I'm doing a sort of a career change where I'm going from machine learning side of things to analytical engineering side of things, analytics engineering side of things, and I can just call up people I have met through PyCon or other places and be like, I don't know how to think about it. Can you tell me what should I Google? And they'll save me probably like a week's worth of Googling, right? So it's exceptionally, it helps in that way that it shortens or accelerates your learning curve, but not in the way you would think that the companies in India or especially startups in India are bad at this. They don't. I have definitely gotten more job offers based on the undergrad I went to 5 years ago than based on the fact that I have a book, which is just like
Incidental.
some different.
Yeah, yeah. And given your experience working with startups, what has been the remote versus co-working kind of an experience? What has been your take? What do you see that growing into?
I think I'm definitely pro remote. I think, but companies or teams which take a completely pro remote stand or a completely in office stand, I think they're perfectly fine. I think people or teams who try to do a hybrid of any sort, or 2 days in office or versions thereof. Oh, you know what? We have India hybrid, that we have an office in Bangalore, but you can work from anywhere in India or equivalent in US. That is just bad. That is because you will never put in the effort in setting up processes and cultures which work for remote, and you will
Right.
never set up process effort for things which work in person. So both are bad and both are always work in progress. And the best part is you will always keep telling yourself, you know what, we'll figure it out in some time. And that's, so you're just going to keep delaying it. So either extreme in my understanding is okay, that we'll always be in office or we'll always be remote. Anything in middle is probably a bad trade-off because it's just it doesn't allow you to build habits, routines.
And do you think, again, in your experience, and we are again hypothesizing here, but do you think companies slash recruiters, is it in their interest to really give a lot more attention to whether they're going to go remote or co-located? Because the so-called great resignation wave never happened in India. Musical chairs are going on. People are, it's a race to the top, unlike the race to the bottom. But is there incentive enough for them to actually take a stance on things like this? Or is it that, yeah, whatever be the case?
It's a founder question, at least for early teams. It's a culture question. So
Right.
it's a, by extension, it goes to founder and not the recruiter. The culture is basically, it flows down to how do you want to shape up the routines and habits of your organization, right? Do you want it to be something which is focused on in person? So you pick that stance and you go with it. And then the recruiter obeys that mandate that I will
Right.
tell candidates upfront that this is going to be in person. It's the, and not the other way around. You cannot build your habits and rituals with the by responding to a change in the market dynamic unless that change is permanent, right? I don't believe that this great resignation or this extremely high turnover or change is permanent. I expect that this will plateau out really quickly because a lot of people don't realize this, but engineering interviews are extremely high mentally and emotional cost. And that is exactly why offer shopping happens, because you have somehow every company has managed to ask the same interview questions. So it's, if I'm going to put in that much effort, I might as well interview everywhere. That's exactly the dynamic which is going on. So either you differentiate on the interview questions, processes, employer branding, and people by default don't want to. So once these salaries have figured out an equilibrium, I think this will begin to plateau out. I don't think that this is going to be a lasting 5-10 year change. And for any late stage founder, they should make culture bets which are at least 3 to 5 years. You have already figured out your late stage. I'm assuming you've figured out monetization. You've figured out some sort of unit economics. So you know how much I have to raise, how much can I raise, and all of those things. And you have at least a year, maybe 2 years of runway. So with those assumptions, you can take 3 year, 5 year culture bets.
And one question that I wanted to ask earlier, which suddenly struck me, was how important is it for engineers to create a website of their own where they write and articulate their thoughts? How does it help in their work as well, in order to be thinking better and articulating themselves better? And has that helped you in general? Just writing your thoughts down, blogging these longish essays?
The essays part of it probably has not. The notebooks part of it, like the book as an example, or anything which I do, technical documentation or something like that, more definitely has. So I don't think that there is a lot of, it's one of those things which if you enjoy, you should.
Okay.
That there are enough rewards for you to do this consistently, both in terms of your skill as well as in terms of people understanding how you think. It's way easier for both of you. You save a lot of things because you can read much faster than you can talk. That's the human experience. But there is no inherent upskilling by the virtue of writing, is what I believe.
Okay.
Especially in the essay, writing essays or talk. It's the thing that if you write essays, you get better at writing essays, or you get better at thinking about those topics. Since I've been writing about career and thinking about career, I get better at writing and thinking about career. It doesn't help my day-to-day tasks, right? The only thing which will help my day-to-day task is doing the day-to-day task and thinking, writing about that. For instance, if tomorrow I start writing about, I don't know, data engineering stacks, that will help a lot, because now that becomes like a cache of what I'm thinking. I can pull from that. And I do write those documentation. It's just that I don't flip them to public. They're typically internal memos,
Correct.
which I used to write at World and write at every workplace. But yeah.
No, does that help in getting started much faster?
Oh yeah. So once you have writing as a habit, right, the friction is gone, right? So
Correct.
for instance, the moment I have an idea crystallized in my head, technical or otherwise, I don't have friction on how will I write, how will I structure a sentence. So for me, that is syntax, right? How programmers think about syntax. I can focus on pure logic. And assuming that most people let's assume that I'm median, that means that at least half of the population is less smart than me and has less attention span than me. We get a lot of upside by not keeping a lot of things in your head. You can focus on the logic. Once that is figured out, you start writing, because you can like that. Because if you think about both things at the same time, you just can't, right? That requires a different level of intelligence and attention span, which I just don't have anymore. I used to at some point. I don't have it anymore.
And again, something completely different from what all we've spoken till now. What all interests you outside of writing books about natural language processing, Python programming? What else interests you in general?
I used to do a lot of kettlebell. I don't do that anymore, and I miss that. So I think I'll start that again before this year end. So I had a wrist injury, and that is why I had to stop doing that. And then I tried it again after I recovered a bit, and it was still bad. I think now I'm strong enough to start it again. Let's see how that goes. So I will do that. Otherwise, I host for the last few months, every few weekends, I've hosted board game nights for folks around me. I've come to enjoy that. That's a recent hobby. I think my hobbies keep changing with time. I have also spent some time learning Urdu so that I can appreciate ghazals. Didn't work out. I realized Urdu is very hard. Then I spent some time, meaningful amount of effort actually, learning Mandarin. So now I can actually follow like scenes in Chinese movies where they're ordering at a restaurant. The only thing is they will say, "Oh, I want this something, let's say like a fish dish." I can say, "Oh, this person ordered fish," but I don't know what of fish.
Okay.
So yeah, that is with subtitles, because again, I can read much better than I can listen.
Right.
But yeah, so yeah, I enjoy doing these kind of hobbies where I will learn something and do something like that.
And are you deliberate about the hobbies that you pick to pursue? Or this is why I want to do Mandarin, this is why I want to do kettlebell?
Kettlebell is very obvious, right? It's one of those
Correct.
exercises which combines, you can do cardio and strength both. It's very few like that, right? Otherwise, every weight is like a weight and you can't do cardio.
Right.
Kettlebell, you can mix both. And as an asthmatic, it's very important for me to be able to do both because I can ramp up strength much faster than you can ramp up cardio. So because of asthma, my lungs get tired way before my legs and arms do. So it's like the ratio is completely off of how much power versus endurance is like. My ratio is very off. I can generate way more power than endurance. So that is why kettlebell. And for Mandarin, it was like, this is COVID lockdown. I was like, and a lot of the natural language processing, best natural language processing work happens in Mandarin because Beidou does and Alibaba do a lot of work, interesting work, which I would say in some of the speech work around speech, I think Beidou does a lot better work than Google or Facebook even. Like it feels like they're a few years behind in some ways. Very recently, that is how it used to feel. So all of their documentation is in Mandarin. So that was my motivation for initially trying to learn Mandarin, because in translation, even with Google Translate, it just butchers it. Because those translations are not meant for technical docs, right?
Correct.
So it just butchers it completely. So that was my motivation for Mandarin. I don't think I'm that deliberate. I don't think so. There is this concept of what, or this idea, at least in my head, that what are you getting out of a hobby? If you're learning a hobby with a proxy goal, then you should either escalate that goal to, oh, this is something very important, and you stop assuming this is a hobby. You say this is a side project and do it really well. That is how actually I did Mandarin for the longest. I assumed it is a side project, and I tried to spend at least 2-4 hours every week on it, sometimes more if I. Or you say this is a hobby, you do it for the sheer pleasure of it.
Correct.
The only contradiction is that to derive pleasure from absolutely anything is that you have to first spend a lot of time doing it and getting good at it.
Right.
So with that awareness, I have that awareness now. I will only enjoy it once I'm good at it, right? I have seen that curve with learning kettlebell, with learning a lot of matrix math, a bunch of these things. So yeah, now I'm willing to put in that effort though. And then there are personality quirks. There are some people who are very comfortable with spending an hour every day, or even let's say 2 hours every weekend, and they will be able to stick with something for years on end. They will be okay with it. I am the kind of person who will do something in like large 10-hour chunks, absolutely obsessed about it for weeks, months as required, and then taper off, and then I can maintain it. That is, but I need that initial pain to get over as soon as possible. Get to that point of pleasure where as soon as possible. That is something also I've discovered through trial and error. That applies to hobbies, that applies to almost anything learning.
Right.
So yeah, that is not that deliberate, but yeah.
Yeah, but there is a target state of flow that you have in mind.
Yeah, there's a flow state in mind, not a Mandarin is important because of some other commercial or career reason. If it was, then I would not call it a hobby, and I would say it's a side project, basically. I would prioritize it much higher.
Okay. And I think we've come to the end of our allotted time. One of the last few questions. So, any books, podcasts, people that have influenced you, and ones that you would recommend to people when they think about their future relevance?
Interesting. I would say read, instead of like before I say specific books, I would say read books which are either very new or very old. So a book which is 10 years old is perhaps the worst book to read. A book which is 30 years old is great. A book which is 2 months old is great. 2 months old book means that it's probably so fresh that it is relevant because of its freshness.
Right.
And a book which is 30 years old and still popular probably argues that it's sticky, that the ideas are so relevant and transferable, and people have not struggled to transfer it. As an example, Andy Grove's High Output Management is an exceptional management book, which has been recommended by Mark Zuckerberg, has been recommending it for 15 years at this point. So it's like a legit Lindy book. It's going to stick around for a meaningful amount of time. And then there are extremely fresh books, for instance, which might be relevant. So as an example, Radical Candor was a book on the Netflix culture. Exceptionally low return on time on reading on that particular book, but that is an example of a fresh book still. And okay, now to answer specific questions, books which I would recommend. I think the most gifted book or most recommended book which I have is Courage to be Disliked. And that's a nice, empowering take on psychology. The most psychology or self-help books on the two extremes that, oh, it's all your past's fault. We discussed a career relevant example of this, that all the education system I went through was all around obedience. So I don't know how to ask questions or challenge authority. okay, that was like you finished your undergrad stuff like 5 years ago, man. What are you arguing about? And so this is, don't blame the past. That is one of the themes in Courage to be Disliked, and it also prioritizes relationships over everything else. So that was a meaningful frame of mind for me. So I've struggled really hard to internalize the ideas of that book. I think I've read that book every year or two since I first read it. Relevant to Engineering Careers is another book, Effective Engineer by Edmund Law. I think every engineer should read that, just because it's like this one of those nice blend of how to think about engineering in context of both the skill part of the hierarchy as well as the traditional leveling hierarchy, that okay, do you want to become a VP of engineering? Maybe not. This is why you wouldn't want to become a VP of engineering or manager or something like that. So it's like a good blend of those. A very good blend. It's also, at this point, I read it first in 2015 when it came out, and at this point it's a 6-year-old book. I would argue that it's still fresh, or so it's still relevant to me at least. And yeah, and I think we discussed Derek Sivers. So I think Derek Sivers' essays are way better than his books, at least as of now. So I can tell you some essays off my mind, right? For instance, there is Obvious to You, Amazing to Others. There is the one which is Standard Paces for Chumps. But these are essays which, at one point, the Standard Pace for Chumps is the essay which I had printed out and stuck on my wall. That was brilliant. I think Sam Altman has a essay on how to think about habits, routines, success, basically something very American view of productivity, but still useful. People should read that, especially when they're early in their career. Yeah, I think those are all the reading recs. Podcasts, I'm not a great listener, I would say. I'm a much better reader than listener, simply because of the speed trade-off. I can skim in reading. Oh, this is a section I know. I've read this in a different book. Skip. Yeah.
And any people that you would recommend following on Twitter or
Oh,
like that?
I think that would very depend a lot on your interests. What I would say is a heuristic for selecting who to follow. Heuristic for selecting who to follow is people or an ideology or a way of thinking, whatever you want to call it, or topics or whatever, which you would want to do either in the next 3 months or in the next 5 years. Right? That's very straightforward. So, for instance, the reason I follow a lot of what you might call people in 30s and 40s, because I know I'll be 30 in 5 years. And when they tweet at 2 a.m. saying, you know what, my kid has spilled something, I'm like, this funny, as well as it's something which like you're mentally priming yourself for. And then obviously people who tweet technical things which are immediately interesting or relevant to me. Both of these extremes are good, is how I would select. Pick for basically what you want to, and don't follow hobby stuff, is what I would say. Hobby in the sense that don't follow empty calories. Don't follow Katrina Kaif or Narendra Modi on Twitter. They're probably not that high value. Almost all politics on Twitter are actually very low value. You're much better off reading like some classics on politics. You're much better off following historians on Twitter than following politicians on history, because politicians is just history done live.
Right.
So, and so it's much more fun, much more detailing to do history or something like that.
One thing I just wanted you to expand on the Lindy book that you mentioned, just for the benefit of our audience, the Lindy effect that Taleb talks about, if you can just,
I think, let me actually do one thing. Let me look up the exact definition of it as well.
Yeah, I think it's to do with with a cafe or a restaurant which existed from
yes,
his
so the
grandmother's time or something.
yeah, so the
right?
basic idea is that there are certain things which get better with age, and by virtue of the fact that it has existed so long, it will continue to exist. And there are certain things for which this is not true. As an example, by the virtue of the fact a human has been alive for 100 years does not mean that it will be alive for the next 100 years. But you can argue that the Bible has been around for 2100 years, so it is likely to be around for the next 2100 years also. That the Bible is a book which you should read even if you're not a Christian. It's a relevant idea or a relevant set of ideas, whatever you want to call it. So that's basically is how I look at
Timeless.
less about timeless, because there are certain things which are like classics are basically about timeless, right? For instance, Shakespeare might be timeless, but that doesn't guarantee that it will still be okay. Shakespeare probably still will be, but let's say art of any kind. Art is very contemporary and art responds to culture, right? So the reason why we find Van Gogh so mesmerizing is because we now find absurdity and horror mesmerizing, right? I think Van Gogh 200 years ago, or even during World War, when horror was live and not an art, it would be very different, I think.
Right.
So In that sense, art may or may not be Lindy, but by the virtue of the fact that Van Gogh has survived for 400 years, might still be popular, but may not be. Art is more, art responds to culture and culture responds to art, both. But ideas are more insular and sticky in that sense. So I'm trying to drive a very soft partition between what you think as art and what you think as abstractions, right?
Yeah. So I think the relevance is what we are looking for, whether they're still years later, right?
Yeah. And in fact, so one of the things which I think, I don't know if Taleb argues, but a lot of people say that you should only look at hundreds of years old ideas, right? And you invariably end up selecting for things like Karl Marx and
Correct.
Plato and whatnot. I don't think that is strictly true, because you're probably not going to live for 100 years. Karl Marx has been dead for some time now, right? It's way more relevant and interesting for you to read, let's say, books or ideas from, let's say, Mao or Deng Ping, which were Chinese communist influencers, and equally influential in Indian communism, if you're going to study communism, because they will have effects in your next 30-year lifespan of how people think about socialism, communism, because they're derived from the same source. I don't think even people who talk about, oh, we want socialism or communism, have read Karl Marx, right? They're probably ripping off more recent versions.
The Blinkist version.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, the Blinkist version. So it's okay if you read something which is 30, 50 years old, and you don't have to read like only Bible. You can also read books in between.
All right. On that note, Nirant, we'll come to the end of this conversation. But before you go, I'm going to ask you for your hot take on certain things. So basically, I want you to give your opinion on what is the future relevance of, the first one is, what is the future relevance of hyper local delivery? I think at the time of recording, we are talking about 10 minutes of delivery. So what is the future relevance of hyper local delivery?
The way I look at it is, it's infrastructure, right? If you can actually bring it down to very small times, that means most kitchens, at least household kitchens, will stop maintaining inventory of a lot of things, because you can do it in real time. That is interestingly how we think about a lot of things even today, right? Like electricity, gas. People who have piped gas, they don't have cylinders. They don't have an inventory of gas or fuel. Why would you keep inventory? Maintaining inventory is expensive. And if there is a cost effective way of doing it, it's a good cultural shift. That is exactly the same case I have for cloud kitchens, by the way. That why would I maintain an inventory of food if it's just expensive for me? And it also reduces my options and taste trade-off and all of that. So yeah, I think it's a net good. And people who say that, oh, it's a bad thing, is people who would have argued that space research is bad for India to do, or nuclear research is bad for India to do in 50s and 60s. And it's human tendency to argue that infrastructure improvements are bad because they're not short term. They're all long term gains in case they work out. And you have to first build them and then see it works out. You have to first build roads and then hope that restaurants will get built around roads and cities will expand because of roads. You cannot argue that, oh, you know what, roads are bad because, see, there are no restaurants there. There are no people living there. Why are you building a road there? That just doesn't work that way. You have to first build infra.
Okay, we usually we go for very light topics, but I'm going to throw in a super heavy one here, Nirant. What do you think is the future relevance of democracy?
Interesting. So there is, okay, so for a little bit of context, right? I'm probably still I'm not really well read on this set of ideas. I'm probably better read on, let's say, international politics, history, and parts of sociology, because I had some undergrad training and then few years of reading on that. I think we'll see a meaningful shift in how democracies are structured in response to, and we'll have a lot more functional competencies being brought in, because what we've realized is that elected leaders are invariably popular leaders, but they're not functional experts. And the assumption was that these people will be able to elect or hire functional experts or bring them in. So a very good example of this was the planning commission which Manmohan Singh built up, which in turn said, oh, you know what, I will not do this, let's set up TRAI. Let's set up a real estate regulatory body, and so on. And then we will have people stay in TRAI for years. And now it has gone wrong again, because TRAI's authority has been eroded by the political flavor and the judiciary, which is indirectly influenced by the political flavor of the day. So I suspect that is going to be relevant. And when that happens, I suspect there will be a lot more filtering on what democracies can do. So in the sense that we might see a rise of city states in some ways. So city states, as an example, you will see that like in US, which has the most federal of popular democracy structure, Texas now has an anti-abortion law, which has de facto approved as of now, at least by the US Supreme Court, like implicit approval, which was not possible, right? That's a shift in how people think about it. I think in India, we're also seeing a version of it by creating smaller and smaller states every 5 generations or so. And each state is basically structured around one city or one capital of some sort, right? So, for instance, I think an extremely large fraction of Karnataka's revenue come from Bangalore. One way to think about the Karnataka government is that they take money from Bangalore, give it to rest of Karnataka. They subsidize rest of Karnataka. You can extend this argument to say the southern part of the country, which is export oriented, subsidizes the northern part of the country, which is agriculture oriented. This will, the federations will probably force democracies to restructure this in some way or the other. It's a guess to make, but I like it's one of those things which, like, my guess is as bad as yours, right? Kind of thing. Or I should actually say that this is what I hope, that incentives are better aligned for elected leaders as well as functional experts, that they're not just subsidizing. I get the benefits of subsidization in democracies. That's one of the things which democracies are supposed to do. But when does that tip the balance is the question.
Okay. And the final one, what do you think is the future relevance of the current recruitment processes in India and especially in engineering colleges in India?
Engineering colleges in India, I suspect that they will not change very quickly. It's again going back to our India ideas, right? They've taken 30 years to solidify. I think it will be very hard to change them overnight. And I will be very worried if they do, because as much as I hate the process and I criticize it, I also realize that uh, the middle class in India values predictability over exceptional outcomes. And I myself do that, right? I pick jobs based on predictability, not on exceptional outcomes. So a predictably bad process is better than a unpredictably new but better process. So in that sense, I would expect this to last much longer. I don't think that it will change in the near 2 to 5 year window in any meaningful scale or volume ways, at least on the college level.
All right. I think Nirant, we touched upon a whole range of topics and themes. You started with your own book writing journey, why, where, when, how, and then we spoke about startups and what is different about American startups, non-Indian startups, their culture with respect and as against Indian startups. And I think now we ended this conversation talking about democracy and engineering colleges. So I think we've covered the whole range. We should keep some topics for a follow-up conversation later.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah. See you.
Thanks a lot, Nirant.